we know that the CLL is a disease of the elderly. In the average age of diagnosis, 71, 72, but a significant percentage of CLL patients are over 80. Some suggest around 1 out of 5 CLL patients are over 80. And often, it's not only that they're underrepresented in trials, they're excluded from trials. Even in some of the trials for the elderly, they put an upper age limit. So it was interesting to see that there's been some recent research on these groups. One was presented today at iwCLL in the Young Investigators meeting and looked at what the outcomes were for the elderly patients, looking retrospectively at data from Mayo Clinic. And what they showed, as we might expect, is that patients who received the new novel targeted therapies did much better and tolerated those much better than the old chemo-type drugs, especially the alkylating agents, where the life expectancy was considerably shorter. At the ICML, the International Conference on Malignant Lymphoma, back in June earlier this year, they looked at one specific drug, acalabrutinib, in those over 80, and found that it was generally well tolerated and had comparable efficacy to those in the younger population. So it's good to be seeing that this is being studied. What I push as a patient advocate is that the patients that you're studying should be the patients that you're treating. And this should include the elderly. This should include people with comorbidities. You shouldn't exclude people because they have a kidney problem or they have a second cancer, but these people are always excluded from trials, and that makes the trial data look better than it is in the real world. And it also leaves a dilemma for the clinician and the patient because there's no data to guide these patients. Almost all of these patients have some comorbidities. I think that this is an important role for clinicians and patient advocacy groups to push to make sure that the patients that are being studied represent the real world patients that will be treated. This is going to take some movement, not just from the organizations, but the regulatory organizations, because they can have very finite demands on who's being studied, and in order to jump over that bar, there's a temptation to really restrict how the trials are done. So it's going to take work with regulatory organizations too. In the US, they're making strong moves to make sure that underserved populations, communities of color, impoverished communities, communities that have traditionally stayed away from clinical trials, are being more represented in clinical trials. So we have to make that same kind of concerted move that we're making for our African American communities and other underserved communities for our elderly community. I would argue even more so for the elderly, the introduction of less toxic, more targeted agents have been a game changer, a sea change, and allowed the elderly to enjoy a higher quality of life with simple, often all oral therapies that give them a chance for prolonging their life and sometimes living the same life expectancy as someone without CLL. It's been a revolutionary change.